What is up, guys? Neo Unstoppable here, just bringing you guys a quick tutorial. If you'd like to learn how to play Magic the Gathering, I'd appreciate if you join me through the adventure. I always encourage people to play this game. I love having new players and people new to the series, so hopefully this is informational for you. It's kind of a longer video. I'm going to go into some pretty heavy details here. There's a lot of rules to the game. It's kind of a complicated game, but the basics of the game are not complicated at all. Really, really super simple. Pretty much all the card games like Yu-Gi-Oh!, Pokemon, anything that's come out like that is a copycat of this original game, Magic the Gathering. So it is by far the simplest game, being as though the attack and defense power of creatures in it is usually in the single digits, where in the other ones it's either hundreds or thousands in Yu-Gi-Oh's case. So this is a really good game. I love it. I've been playing it for years, and if you like the video, I would appreciate you hit the like button. But you don't have to. If you didn't like it, that's okay. Leave me comments on how I can improve, or if you did like the video, go ahead and leave a comment or a shout out to me. I really appreciate it. Thanks, guys, and enjoy the video. Okay, so we've got a few cards here. Just going to be explaining the basics and physically showing you everything we've got here. Magic the Gathering is a turn-based game, so one person would take their turn. It would go through various steps and phases, and then the next person would take their turn. The basics, though, are this is the core of what you should have in your deck, and that is land types. There's 5 different land types. You've got mountains, which are red and produce red mana. You've got forests, which are green and produce green mana. You've got plains, which are white and produce white mana. Swamps, which are black and produce black mana. And you've got islands that are blue, and they produce blue mana. Most cards that actually have a color coding, other than artifacts, which we'll get to later, have a mana cost, and all the respective mana costs will be on the top right hand corner of the card, as you guys can see here. Let me just bring this one up a little bit closer. So yeah, it's kind of blurry, but if you can't really see it in the camera, but these are 2 little pictures of a forest, and then it's got a number next to it in gray, which is on this card is a 4. So, in other words, this card costs 4 mana of any color and 2 green mana. So 2 of the mana that you have to use has to be green, and the 4 can be mana of any other type. Alright. There's different types of cards as well. So when you play, you can put 1 mana out per turn on your first main phase, and I'll get to the phases later on in this episode. But what you essentially do is you take your mana and you tap it like this to signify that that mana has been used this turn, and it does not untap unless a card effect tells you that it untaps, or at the beginning of your next turn during your untap phase, it'll untap all of your mana and anything that's tapped for that turn. You'll be able to reuse that. So they add up per turn, so you won't be able to get this card out until you have had enough turns to put out 2 green mana and then 4 of any other kind. There's different types of mana, different types of lands, rather, I'm sorry. There's obviously different types of mana. I've got it all right here for you. But there's different types of lands, and I'll go into that in a later, more advanced video. But for the core and what you should start with, in my opinion, is what's called a mono deck, and I'll do deck building in a different episode for you guys. But what a mono deck consists of is all of 1 color. You can also do what's called multicolored decks, which brings me to this next card that I have here for you. I'm not sure if this will show up on the camera, but you can see the 3 different, you can kind of see by color coding, that there are 3 different colors. One's green, one's blue, and one's red. So this costs a converted mana cost of 3 mana. 1 has to be green, 1 has to be blue, and 1 has to be red. So you would put this in a deck that consists of these 3 mana right here. And so to put this out, you would tap these, and you would play this card. Now, there's different types of cards, like I was saying earlier. This one happens to be an instant. This is a creature, this is an enchantment, and a sorcery. Okay, this is also enchantment, this first card that I showed you here. It's an enchantment aura, meaning this type of enchantment will go on top of and affect 1 single creature. The main thing that's important that I'm going to teach you in this episode is creatures. So the main things that are important about a creature is, number one, their mana cost, which for him you can't really see the number, but the gray number next to those 2 green mana is a 5. So in order to play this, you would have to tap 2 lands that have to be green, and then 5 of any other color. So a total of 7 lands have to be tapped in order to put this on the field. Now, what's important to note also about creatures is at the bottom right hand corner they will have 2 numbers. It'll have a number and then a slash and then another number. This one has 7/7. The first number on the left side is the power, and the second number is the toughness. So essentially one is an offensive measure, one is a defensive measure. So if this creature, I'll get into how combat works in more detail in different videos, but just as a beginner's guide, if this creature were to fight something that had 7 power, and this took damage from it, this would die and go into my graveyard. I'll get into how you set up everything and where all the cards go and how many cards you have in your hand and all that in the next video. But just for time's sake, in this introduction video, I'm just explaining to you the basics. So if this is attacking something or blocking something that has 7 power, this will die. If that has less than 7 toughness, that will also die. This does 7 damage, so if this is attacking directly to another player, they will take 7 damage. And I'll get into that also a little bit later. There's multiple different ways for you to win the game. One of the ways is by dealing enough damage to the other player that's unblocked damage so that they die. Each player starts out with a life total of 20, so I would have to attack with this 4 times in order to kill somebody. Or I'm sorry, 3 times rather. Also with a creature, you'll notice here in the middle, it says creature, and then there's a dash and it says elemental, because that's what this creature type is. Some of them will say summon creature. It depends what block the card is from, but they will usually, if it's a creature, it will have a creature type, and those are also called tribes, and I'll get into that in a later video. But essentially what you could do if you wanted to, which would be a little bit more cohesive for deck building, is you could build a deck that has no creatures except for elementals. That way if you have spells or abilities that affect other elementals, it's more likely that you'll be able to trigger those effects or activate them or have them benefit you if they're passive abilities. You can tell what is an ability or an effect by what is in this box here. Sorry, right here. Same goes for all of these cards. It's essentially what would be called an effect box if you are into other card games like Yu-Gi-Oh! Or anything like that. This tells you what it does. Now you'll also see sometimes that, for example, this card here and this card here and even down here, it has smaller letters. Those aren't actually effect, it's just a background lore kind of for the card or for whatever effect it does. But the most important thing is what is in this box, the first thing you can read. And this one happens to say, you may have Thorn Elemental, which this is the name of the card and it tells you the name right here. You may have Thorn Elemental deal its combat damage to the defending player as though it were not blocked. So essentially if I attack with this, I can shoot and it is blocked. I can choose whether this damage goes directly to the player or whether the damage is dealt to the creature that blocks it. I have a choice. So that's a special effect. They won't all have that exact effect. Different things have different effects. And obviously this attack and or defense number will most likely be higher if the mana cost is higher. Typically lower mana cost cards are not as strong as a creature. But that's not always the case. Sometimes you'll have a very low mana cost creature that is very strong but will have a negative effect. For example, when this card comes into play, you may lose 10 life, things like that. So it's not always about the mana to whether the card is a good card or not. But what you want to try and do is aim for the lowest mana cost possible, unless that card is like the biggest card that you're going to be using in your deck. So we've got a creature here. This is an instant, and this is a sorcery, okay? So these two cards are a one-time use card. They're the only thing in the game that is not a permanent. If you ever seen an effect box, a certain thing that affects the number of permanents that you control or that are on the battlefield, everything that is here that I'm showing you, that you can see in the camera right now, is a permanent except for these two cards. These are a one-time use cards. There are some exceptions to that. So, because cards could have flashback, which means you can cast them from your graveyard. But for the basic purposes, I'm not going to get into that, and I'll just go ahead and leave you guys with the knowledge that these are one-time use cards. You pay the mana cost for them. That mana stays tapped, and then the effect happens that's on the card. So this is an instant, and this is a sorcery. So I told you they're both spells, and also creature cards are also spells. So if something is affecting, and so are enchantments, artifacts, and all that, those are all spells. You play the game in the role of a planeswalker, so you're casting spells and using different abilities to try and destroy your opponent. These specific spells, like I said, are cast, and then the effect happens and it goes to your graveyard. The difference between an instant and a sorcery is a sorcery can only be cast by you on your turn during your main phases. An instant can be cast by you during your turn or during their turn, regardless of what phase they're in. So if when they're in their combat phase and they're declaring attackers, if I want to cast this, I can. If I want to cast this, I cannot. I have to wait until my turn on my main phases to be using that. You have 2 main phases per turn. Okay, so just to give you a quick rundown. Now this, you also got to keep in mind, when things have different colors, they're multicolor cards, they usually will cost less mana because it's hard. You have no guarantee that you're actually going to draw the cards to get 3 different colors. So this is a good card if you have all 3 of these and your deck is made up of mountains, forests, and islands. So in those conditions, this would be considered a good card. So it's an instant, so I can cast it on their turn. Now what the effect tells me is counter target creature spell, put 2 +1/+1 counters on up to 1 target creature. Okay, so I explained to you what this number was down here. One is the toughness, and the other one is the power, and that's what this is referring to when it says +1/+1. So 2 +1/+1 counters on this 1 target creature would make this a 9/9. So it would say 9 here for its attack, 9 here for its defense. So something that has 9 attack, or we'll just call it attack for the basic purposes. If it doesn't have 9 attack, this would survive an encounter with it. And just like attacking, whether it attacks directly to a player or it attacks another creature, it would kill that creature or deal 9 damage to the opponent. Okay, so that's what this instant does. Now when it says counter target creature spell right here, like I said earlier, everything that you do is casting a spell. So when I physically, on my turn, when I am playing this card, it's a creature, but it's a spell. So if I have this mana and I tap all this mana for it, on my turn, this can still be cast, even though it's being casted on an enemy. By an enemy on my turn, it's an instant, so it can do that. And the first effect says counter target creature spell. So when I cast this, what's referred to in this game as a stack is being put down. So this doesn't resolve until the whatever is on the stack resolves in the order last to first. I'll explain the stack later. It's a little bit complicated, especially when you get into counters and things like that. But essentially, what will happen is I will cast this on my turn, and then my opponent will cast this and counter target creature spell. He'll target this. So before this even comes into play, my mana's tapped for it. Before this resolves, the next thing that was cast after it goes on the stack. Now I have an opportunity to cast another card that could possibly counter this if I had the mana or something else, but saying that I didn't, and maybe I tapped all my mana to bring that creature out, what will happen is these are the 2 cards that are stacked, so they're on the stack. This one will resolve first, and it will counter this creature spell. So this will go into my graveyard and will not be on the battlefield for me to use. That's what happens when a spell is countered. Its effect doesn't come into play, and it's as if it was never cast at all. That's what happens when you counter something. So then, after this spell is countered, my opponent would be able to put 2+1/+1 counters on one target creature that they control. So that's what an instant is. This is a sorcery. This is the mana cost for it, so it's kind of a high mana cost. I don't know if you can see it. It's 5 of any color, and then 2 of them have to be black. So that is a total of a 7. The converted mana cost, which is the total mana that would have to be tapped to play this card, is 7. So it's a sorcery. It can only be cast on, if I'm the one that's casting it, on my turn in one of my main phases. So once I pay this mana and tap it, that mana remains tapped till the end of my turn. The effect here is target player discards his or her hand. So I can target myself or I can target them. There's different situations where you might be choosing yourself as a target, which it might seem unlikely, but there are cases where that could be beneficial. But in this case, I would try and choose the opponent. And if I was playing this card, I would probably try and wait until they activated something where they drew more cards or had a lot of cards in their hand for whatever reason. So this is a sorcery. It can only be cast on your turn. Now, this card is an enchantment. I'll show you the mana cost here. It is 2 of any color and then 2 red mana. So essentially, in order to play this card, I tap the mana and I put it out. But in the effect box, it states this: if this card is in your opening hand, you may begin the game with it on the battlefield. So in that case, if it was in my opening hand, I would reveal it and put it onto the battlefield and not have to pay its mana cost. The game would begin with it on the battlefield. That's not a very rare thing to happen, but it is an effect in some cards. Now what this does is it has an always active ability. And that active ability, there's 2 conditions to it. Players can't gain life, and damage can't be prevented. Now there's some cards that, for example, I can cast a card that says deal 2 damage to target player, right? If I cast that, someone else, my opponent, could cast prevent X amount of damage to target player or to you, or prevent all damage that would be dealt to you this turn, something along that effect. But because of this ability, they cannot prevent that damage, so it will deal damage directly to them. And the first thing, players can't gain life. There's several cards, specifically most of them are green. Some of them are also white, where you cast the card, whether it be an instant sorcery or sometimes it's even a creature that comes onto the battlefield, and it'll have you gain life for whatever reason. Like I said, you start out with 20 life. Once you hit 0, that's one of the conditions of losing the game. There's other conditions. The 2 most dominant ways to beat somebody are reducing their life total to 0, or if they have no cards left in their library and something happens to the point where they would have to draw a card and they cannot draw a card, they lose the game. So essentially, if they run out of cards and it becomes their turn, at the beginning of your turn you draw 1 card. If they cannot draw that 1 card, they lose the game. You win, regardless of what the life totals are. That you could have 100 life and they could have 1 and they can't draw a card, they lose. Or vice versa. They could have 100 life. You could have 1, they almost kill you, but it turns out it's their turn and they don't have a card to draw, they lose the game. So those are the 2 most common ways of winning or losing. There's also effect cards that can happen that adjust the rules to that a little bit. I'll get into those in more advanced games, more advanced videos, I'm sorry. But this is the basics of how the game works. These are the things that you have to know about. Also, the one thing that I have left to tell you guys about, this is an artifact card. Okay? So, usually these are colorless. And the number that that's up there for the mana cost, you probably can't see it, but it is a 2. Meaning I can use 2 of any of these colors in any combination that I want to play this artifact. Now artifacts, sometimes are equipment. They can be equipped to a creature, and they'll have an equipped cost that you have to pay to equip it to the creature, but it'll affect the creature. Maybe give it +1/+1, or maybe give it a special effect, and I'll get into effects later with things like that. There's things like flying, death touch, lifelink, forest walk, swamp walk, all kinds of different things. It's too complicated for a basic video, but I just want to give you guys a quick idea of what's going on. This specific artifact has an effect that's an activated ability, and how you activate it is you pay 3 colorless mana, so mana of any color, and then this symbol right here, you probably can't see, but it's a little tap symbol, and it looks like a little U-turn type of arrow, and then it has a colon. That means once I do these 2 things, then this effect after it happens. I can activate that as many times as I want. But because it has the tap symbol, things don't untap until the beginning of your turn during your untap step. So if this is tapped, under that circumstance, I can't do it. If this is untapped, I can do it. So once I pay 3 mana and tap this, the effect, tap target creature, then return Cyclopean Snare to its owner's hand. So after I do that, the effect says I can tap one of their creatures, but then I have to return this to my hand, meaning I have to pay this 2 mana to put it out all over again, and then I have to pay to activate this again. But this is very useful if you're trying to slow somebody down. For example, especially if they have a creature that's like this, and it's attacking you for 7, 9, or 10, or even 15 damage a turn. That could be a really good way of getting it not to attack, because tapped creatures cannot attack. So, kind of important things to know. In the next video, I'll go over steps and phases of turns, combat phases, drawing, and then I'll do a separate video on deck building. So I hope this has been informational for you. If you'd like to, go ahead and like and subscribe if you want more tutorial videos, or if you're into gaming or card games. Thanks.